In March of 2006, Xinjiang Party Secretary Xi Jinping was interviewed by Lawrence Robert Kuhn, where they discussed leadership and responsibility. Xi explained that under Deng Xiaoping, a three-step strategy was put forward: solve the problems of food and clothing shortages, realize a comfortable life for the people, and complete the nation's modernization. To accomplish these goals, leaders have used a scientific approach, that of trial and testing before implementing programs nationwide. For example, Xi explained, before we implement new policies broadly, we always test them thoroughly at the grassroots level, gain experience, and subject them to analysis. While he admitted that China is not yet where it wants to be in fulfilling Deng's three-step strategy, any rational person has to be impressed at the level of change that has occurred over the last 30 years and the courage it has taken to make such progress. The three steps put in place by Deng Xiaoping are also admirable, as they express the desire to improve the lot of the common man. And one has to believe that at the advanced age of 88, Deng was sincere in his desire when he set China on the path of reform. But as China moves forward economically, is it not advisable that Hong Kong and China's population would do well to view ethics and morality with the same kind of scrutiny as their government has shown toward economics? Should not a scientific approach be considered when it comes to how faithful men and women are to treat one another? If so, if you'd like to learn more, stay tuned. The last century has seen dramatic changes in moral behavior, especially in what are known as the Western nations, principally North America and Europe. A majority of people in America and Europe had a certain consciousness of God at the beginning of the 20th century. Both Christians and Jews looked to some degree to the Bible, and especially the Ten Commandments, as a guiding light for behavior. There was, for example, what was known as the Judeo-Christian work ethic. This is not to say that everyone worked hard or that everyone actually lived by the Ten Commandments, but there was an attempt by many to do so, and this effort brought about significant progress in industry and agriculture and tempered human nature as a whole. During the second half of the 20th century, belief in God and morality in the West deteriorated rapidly. Today, the philosophy of secular humanism prevails in the courts and educational institutions of the West. Secular humanism expresses the view that humans can be ethical and moral and religious without God. But is this so? In theory, it would seem to be, but what about in practice? One major problem with secular humanism is the lack of authority to determine right from wrong. If there is no higher power that defines appropriate behavior, each man is left to himself to decide such matters. And without a higher authority which has power to reward or punish behavior, even when there is agreement on right and wrong, people will do what they want to do if they think they can get away with it. Let me repeat again what she explained in relation to economics and industrial development. Before we implement new policies broadly, we always test them thoroughly at the grassroots level, gain experience, and subject them to analysis. But has any nation taken the same scientific approach with ethics and morality? The obvious answer is that none has. Now, please do not misunderstand me. I'm not advocating that we do small-scale experiments with human lives to determine which is ethical and moral and what works best. To do so would leave half the subjects on the wrong side of the experiment, and they would suffer tragically as a result. But we do need to open our eyes and look at the facts as they currently are. Our first parents, Adam and Eve, were given a choice. They could trust God to determine right from wrong, or they could trust themselves and their five senses. As any student of the Bible knows, they chose to reject God and trust themselves. And the evidence of their experiment is all around us today. Conflict between peoples and nations, broken families, divorce, disease, and suffering of every kind. Even when we try to worship God, we find ourselves in conflict between varying groups with their own ideas about who God is and how to worship Him. And sadly, many of the bloodiest and longest-lasting wars have been fought over religion. But setting aside the mistake of our first parents and the road that they set us on, let us specifically get back to where we are today and analyze postmodern man's grand experiment in throwing off the laws of God, especially in regard to marital morality. The God of the Bible is not vague when it comes to sexual relations. The Bible makes it clear that it is God who created us as sexual beings. We can read this in the beginning pages of this book. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." We are instructed a little later in the account of the first man and woman created on the earth. "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." The Bible tells us that sex within marriage is good and proper, and marriage is an institution to be honored. But notice how the Apostle Paul contrasts sex within marriage with its use outside of the marriage institution. "Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers God will judge." The Apostle Paul also counsels us to avoid sexual immorality as it brings about harsh penalties. Notice this in 1 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, and verse 18. "Flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body." In spite of these clear instructions and admonitions, sex between unmarried people is rampant in many nations today, and it is considered normal and acceptable behavior. Yet if we refuse to hear God, we can, if we so choose to do so, look at the subject as any scientist would do in evaluating the results of his experiment. Sadly, our experiment in choosing to decide for ourselves what is moral and what is not has gone on way too long, and the results are in. If we have eyes to see, we must conclude that the God of the Bible knew what He was talking about, that the fruits or results of sexual immorality are detrimental to a harmonious society. Consider one of the more obvious consequences of sex prior to marriage, that being pregnancy. According to a March 20th, 2009 article titled "Behind the Boom in Adult Single Motherhood," Amy Sullivan pointed out that fully 40% of all babies born in the United States in 2007 were born to unmarried mothers. This amounted to a staggering 4.3 million babies born out of wedlock. And this statistical figure has consequences. Quoting Ms. Sullivan, "Study after study has shown that babies born to unmarried mothers are at higher risk of ending up in poverty, and that the mothers themselves face educational and economic hurdles. Many excuses are given as to why so many are choosing babies before commitment. One such excuse is that of poverty. People say that men cannot afford to raise a family. But is this reasoning valid? Advice columnist Emily Yoff, writing under the name of Prudence for Slate, an online U.S. magazine, wrote the following in response to this argument. Scholar Kay Heimowitz, author of Marriage and Caste in America, Separate and Unequal Families in a Post-Marital Age, turns the argument around and says it's not that harsh economic conditions lead to women having children without fathers, but that the decision to have children without fathers leads to harsh and self-perpetuating economic conditions. She explains that having the belief that a solid marriage is central to one's life, that it precedes starting a family, encourages women and men to make important choices based on self-discipline and deliberation. Ms. Yoff describes the current single-parent scene in America as a national catastrophe. While she promotes the importance of marriage and family, readers respond with a variety of excuses. Having a child will be stressful and life-altering enough. Parents need to work on their relationship on their own schedule. Or another one, I feel that a baby is its own blessing. Have that blessing before you get married. Or how about this one? How dare you imply that an unexpected pregnancy should lead to marriage? Note that all of these excuses are emotionally, not scientifically based. When she is confronted with the accusation, you are simply out of touch with modern culture, she replies, that may be, but it also means that modern culture is out of touch with the needs of children. Studies have found that children born to single mothers are vastly more likely to be poor, have behavioral problems and psychological problems, drop out of high school, and themselves go on to have out-of-wedlock children. Another popular and unscientifically based misconception is that couples who live together before marriage are able to test how well suited they are for each other and will therefore have a more satisfying and longer-lasting marriage. This may sound good, but do the facts support such a contention? According to the co-director of the National Marriage Project, David Pompano of Rutgers University in the United States, many studies have found that those who live together before marriage have less satisfying marriages and a considerably higher chance of eventually breaking up. One reason is that people who cohabit may be more skittish of commitment and more likely to call it quits when problems arise. But in addition, the very act of living together may lead to attitudes that make happy marriages more difficult. Consider another emotionally based misconception that fails to stand before the facts. Women are also vulnerable to the misconception that a pregnancy, even unintended, can cement a relationship and bring a couple closer together. In fact, all of these statistics show that babies stress relationships. More couples end up splitting than marrying. In today's postmodern world, facts don't seem to matter. We now live at a time when the forces of emotion, personal opinion, self-expression, and the mantra, "Your truth may not be my truth," prevails in the West. And these attitudes are spreading to traditional cultures around the world by way of television, magazines, and the internet. But truth is not fluid. Either something is true and can be backed up with scientific data, or it is not. Note this study. For 10 years, the Fragile Families and Child Well-Being Study at Princeton University has followed the families of 5,000 children, 3/4 born to unwed parents. According to the research, most of these parents, both women and men, said they wanted to get married and to each other. But they somehow feel this mutual decision is beyond their power to make. And by not making it, the forces of inertia start pulling them apart. 5 years after their children's births, only 16% of the couples had married, and 60% had split. Babies and splitting up are only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to sleeping together prior to marriage. Another obvious problem is the spread of life-debilitating disease. Note this shocking Associated Press headline of March the 11th, 2008, describing the state of affairs among American teen girls. According to CDC, that is the Center for Disease Control, at least 1 in 4 teenage girls has sexually transmitted disease. That's from the Associated Press, Tuesday, March 11th, 2008. The article then explains at least 1 in 4 teenage girls nationwide has a sexually transmitted disease, or more than 3 million teens, according to the first study of its kind in this age group. A virus that causes cervical cancer is by far the most common sexually transmitted infection in teen girls aged 14 to 19. Among girls who admitted to ever having sex, the rate was 40%. You see, my friends, the God who created us gave us His laws to protect us from hurting ourselves. But the human race refuses to believe Him. So why then do we also refuse to look at our cultural practices from a scientific perspective? If we will not believe God, why won't we believe the facts? Will not a scientific approach lead us to the correct conclusion of how we ought to conduct ourselves? The biblical proverb found in verse 2 of chapter 26 explains the simple maxim of cause and effect. For every effect, there is a cause. Like a flitting sparrow, like a flying swallow, so a curse without cause shall not alight. Can we not see the biblical proverb in action all around us? When we break God's moral laws, we are under a curse. There are natural consequences that bring pain and suffering. My friends, God is not against us. He is for us, and He wants us to be happy. But to be truly happy, we must avoid certain behaviors which look good on the surface, but bring destruction in the end. Notice another proverb, Proverbs 14:12. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death.
If you would like to discover more about how this topic impacts your life, visit us online at www.lcgcanada.org to read our featured literature free of charge.
God wants us to be happy, but He allows us free moral agency and the ability to make our own decisions. In Deuteronomy, the 30th chapter, verse 19, God calls upon us to make choices in life, and cumulatively, those choices take us in one of two opposing directions. We are told that we have free will to choose, but notice also that God encourages us to make the right choice. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life that both you and your descendants may live. In today's postmodern world, we are told that truth is fluid. What is truth for you may not be truth for me. But is this truth or foolishness? We know that when it comes to building aircraft, truth is based on facts, not opinions. So can we not base moral truth on facts? It really isn't that difficult to evaluate whether a particular behavior leads to blessings or cursings. As we have seen with sex prior to marriage, there are a host of consequences that no one really wants. We are told that one definition of insanity is when someone keeps doing the same thing over again, expecting different results. How long do we as human beings have to keep repeating the same moral mistakes before we wake up to realize that some things simply do not work? If we can approach economics in this scientific way, why can't we evaluate morality based on observation and evaluation? Of course, an even better way is to simply believe God. That way, no one gets hurt in the process. But if we refuse to do that, then, my friends, let us at least evaluate the fruits of our behavior and learn from them. We have seen that sex prior to marriage doesn't work, but what about sexual immorality after marriage? Does it work any better? The answer is clearly no. Many of the same curses apply here: disease, divorce, and deep heartache resulting from betrayal. And of course, there are children who are hurt by parental misbehavior. The foundation of biblical law is known as the Ten Commandments. And one of those commandments is, you shall not commit adultery. Adultery is a voluntary sexual act between a married person and someone who is not his or her spouse. And adultery is rampant in almost every corner of the earth. No significant country is immune from this sin. While most people applaud China's move to a market-oriented economy and the remarkable progress toward improving the physical living standards of hundreds of millions, a sad unintended consequence has accompanied this rise in living standards, and that is adultery. Note this New York Times headline from March the 16th, 1985. China calls adultery a serious problem. The article then goes on to say, adultery has become such a serious problem in China that a group of women is calling for legislation that would make it a crime to break up a marriage, the official New China news agency said today. The growing number of marriage breakdowns caused by the intrusion of third parties has aroused much social concern in China, the agency said. Describing the lovers' triangle as a serious social problem, the agency said of 100 divorced couples interviewed in Peking last month, 20 acknowledged they split up because of the intrusion of third parties. In March of 2000, a senior parliamentary official, Hu Kangcheng, called for updating legislation to reflect social changes that resulted from 2 decades of market-oriented reforms. In his call for changes, Hu explained that the problem of adultery had risen with some people who had become more wealthy and powerful. We should not fail to see that there are some people who, when they become rich and powerful, become subjected to the obsolete and decadent ways of thinking of the feudalist society in the past, he said. They have also become subjected to the invasion of the decadent way of thinking and living of the Western world. As we can see, a significant number of divorces are related to adultery. And so it should not surprise us that as adultery increases, so does the rate of divorce. And over the last decade, the slide has continued. But adultery is only part of the problem. Self-interest, selfishness, and lack of commitment also play their part. According to a 2008 BBC News report, 2007 was a bad year for divorces. The divorce rate in China has increased by almost 20% over the past year, with 1.4 million couples filing for separation during 2007, government officials say. Some experts put the rise down to a change in law which has made divorces easier to obtain. Others say China's one-child policy has produced a generation of adults focused on their own needs and unable, meaning lacking the character, to sustain a relationship. This rising divorce rate is part of a long-term trend. Since China began its market reforms in the late 1970s, the number of people getting a divorce has quadrupled. China continues to progress economically, due in part to a careful scientific approach of testing and carefully evaluating the results. Economic progress over the last 30 years has been nothing less than remarkable, but sadly with it has come many unintended results. Morality is not something that can be easily or effectively legislated. Self-government is essential in the building of a harmonious society, and a genuine relationship with the true God of creation is the only real path to rightly governing the self. After all, it is the law of God that defines authoritatively what real morality is. Jesus said, "The thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly." And Jesus' disciple, John, put it this way, "Beloved, I pray that you may prosper in all things and be in health." God is not against prosperity. Realizing a comfortable life, as Deng expressed it, is what God wants for all men everywhere. But wealth without a moral foundation will not bring a truly comfortable life. Money cannot take away the pain of disease, divorce, and families being ripped apart. In 1 Timothy, the 6th chapter, beginning in verse 6, it gives us a warning, a sober warning. Here the Apostle Paul instructs his disciple, "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Here at Tomorrow's World, we are not so naive as to think that we have the ability of ourselves to change the behavior of even a single person. But we do believe that we can present the truth of the Bible along with factual information, and individuals can choose to respond positively. As we read in Deuteronomy, the 30th chapter, "See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil, in that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways, and to keep His commandments, His statutes, and His judgments. And you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you go to possess." For those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, the results of human behavior are obvious. Disobedience to God's laws brings pain and suffering. Obedience to His laws brings comfort to life. If you'd like to learn more about the subject of today's program and the true God of the Bible and His laws and how they promote a harmonious society, be sure to check out our booklet that will be shown on the screen. And be sure to come back next week, same place, same time, to learn more about the God of creation and His coming kingdom in Tomorrow's World.
If you would like to discover more about how this topic impacts your life, visit us online at www.lcgcanada.org to read our featured literature free of charge.
The preceding program is produced by the Living Church of God.